Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. It is officially 10 a.m. We're going to get started with the webinar today, and we are recording, so you'll be able to go back and reference this later if needed, or share it with others in your office if they weren't able to join today. Welcome to July 1st. Welcome to another program year, another fiscal year. We are excited to get going with this. And we hope that everyone is doing well. Certainly an unusual time. While we do this as a webinar every year, I think we're all getting a lot more used to digital meetings and meeting in this way. So we're doing things a little bit differently this year. Generally, the July 1 VCAP webinar is solely focused on program updates and new policy. Because we missed our in-person training in April, which was focused on BMP maintenance and inspection protocol, we'll be focusing mainly on that. Maura Christian, our assistant coordinator for VCAP, will be leading us through that section of the webinar. And then following that, we'll do a much briefer section on program policies and updates, which I will lead you through. If anyone doesn't know, I'm Kevin McLean. I'm the VCAP coordinator. We're both here at the association office. And we'll talk a bit about what to expect in the coming year. For those who don't know, we do have new funding as of today, so we are officially off a funding wait list. That's good news for everybody. Moving forward, we have implemented a lot fewer program and policy updates this year than we have in years past, with just some minor changes and updates to kind of clarify some language, update a few cost share rates and caps, but we didn't need to dump a whole bunch of new changes to VCAP on top of everything else that's out of whack this year. So we will have the chat box going throughout the webinar. Please ask any questions or any clarifications you need there. While Maura is presenting, I will be manning the chat box, and vice versa once I take over the webinar. We will try to answer all questions in the chat box. If there are any, recurring questions or that we're not able to really tackle in the chat box there, at the end of the webinar, we will address those. But we are going to keep everyone on mute so that we can record a nice clean webinar that everyone can come back to later. And we will save all of those questions in case any of those things need additional clarification after the webinar. That being said, as of this morning, all of our new documents, forms, BMP manual, everything is up on the website. All of that has been updated. You can access it there. And once this recording is finalized, that will also be posted on our website to reference later. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Maura Christian, our VCAP assistant coordinator, to lead us through the first portion of the webinar.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin, so much. And thanks for joining, everyone. I see a lot of district staff and partners. It's great to see you guys all online with us. I know we've all gotten a lot more comfortable with Zoom, so hopefully everyone got on easily. With that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with, oops, my slide's not moving, with part one of today's webinar, and that's going to be maintenance and inspections through the VCAP program. And this is something that we've been wanting to cover for a long time now, and it kind of is a great opportunity this year with this extra time on this webinar that we normally only have program updates given. And it's an opportunity to incorporate some of the training that was canceled back in April due to coronavirus, so it's great to kind of still get that in, and hopefully people can refer back to this. It's going to be posted online as well. But basically today, just want to cover general guidance on BMP maintenance and VCAP policy to help everyone ensure the viability of these BMPs that we're putting in the ground through their 10-year lifespans. So sorry about the phone. Hopefully we can get this to stop. But today's topics to be covered include VCAP maintenance policies, and that's coming straight from the manual. We'll elaborate a little bit more than what's in there, but we're referring really to the maintenance policies that are already in the manual now, kind of differentiating district responsibilities, property owner responsibilities. We'll go over the spot check process more thoroughly than ever, which I'm excited about, and to have that living on our website to help staff know what to look out for when they're going on these spot checks, excuse me, especially early on if they're new district staff, to help them learn that process. We'll go over BMP specific maintenance. So hopefully there's spots here that you'll learn something brand new. We'll go over general expectations for those BMPs over time. I've put together some maintenance calendars from different resources, and those would be great to refer to and help put together applications and help educate homeowners on expectations of what to expect with their BMPs when they're installing them. We'll talk about what to include in the VCAP application in terms of maintenance and common maintenance issues to look out for each BMP that we have. And at the end, we'll just touch on, worst case scenario, if if there are issues with BMPs and they're not compliant with our standards, how are we going to go about the corrections and recommendation process, and worst case scenario, repayment back to the Virginia Association Saltwater Conservation District. So I'll dive right in. And again, feel free to reach out to Kevin or the group, Kevin, in the chat box, and he'll answer as I'm going through. And before I get too into this, I do want to point out that I used a lot of really great resources to put this together today that I've linked at the very end of this PowerPoint that we built off and developed from what's out there already. And that's the CBLP Sustainable Landscape Manual by Cheryl Corson, Anne Arundel County's Rainscaping Manual, the BMP Clearinghouse, of course. We look to them for all of our standards and to help me put together some of this, as well as the Chesapeake Stormwater Network. So just really good resources that are, you can always learn more, and they're out there for you to, even after this is over, go take a peek at. Okay. So I will start off with looking at what's the difference between the expectations for a property owner versus the district's responsibilities in terms of maintenance. And the bottom line is that a landowner, property owner, whatever you like to call it, is responsible to maintain our BMPs as outlined in their operation and maintenance plan for their 10-year lifespan. And Kevin will touch on this later, but we did add another policy this year of, the lifespan start date, and that's in our manual, and he'll go over that as well. And, it's not the district's responsibility to physically maintain these BMPs, but it is important to note that the more the district staff is involved in helping those property owners, applicants, putting together their maintenance plan, talking through what to expect, educating them on expectations, and giving them resources like I just mentioned, the easier this whole process will be. So, end of the day, it is property owner's responsibility, but at the same time, the more the district can be involved and be helpful, the easier the process will be for both, and avoid any bigger issues moving forward. And we do have this Form 3 that is on our website. It is required to be submitted to us with payment requests to be able to send payment to the district to be sent to the landowner. And it lays out really everything that is binding for the landowner in terms of a contract, what they're expected to do. And I just highlighted this one section that the landowner accepts responsibility for the maintenance of the BMP for the duration of its project lifespan, and they're responsible to maintain it as per installation. And all that documentation should be submitted to us with the payment request, so we know what was installed and what is expected to be continued to maintain, and should be maintained as well on the district's ends. And some districts handle this differently. They may collect this at the initial application putting together and submitting to the application for us, or they might just submit it to us for the payment request. Doesn't really matter as long as we have an accurate Form 3 with the correct cost share amount and the correct signatures. So on the other hand, the district's responsibility, and this is more clearly laid out in the manual as well, but this district's role is to check up on the projects that have been installed to ensure they're still viable through the spot check process. And I'm going to go into more detail just after this slide. Districts are responsible to inform their district board and the steering committee, more so for the VCAP staff, if there are issues that are found in terms of non-compliance or any corrective action that's needed. And, like I mentioned before, that's the expectation, but the more district can be involved, the easier this process is going to be. And Kevin, myself, and all the association staff are here to help with any issues. We're a shoulder to lean on. We're not throwing this to you guys without any assistance. We've got your back. And the last little point on here is that the district shall ensure that the BMP is maintained regardless of transfer of property. If property owner moves, it's still responsible, or at the responsibility of the district to be aware of that and get the correct paperwork, or just make sure that it's maintained regardless. And those can be various scenarios, but that's kind of the more broader requirement. So I was just talking about spot checks, and here is the top part of our spot check form. It's a one-page form that's been created recently, and it's really great. And there is one for each BMP type. And these will be done annually, but only a random 25% selection of all active projects need to be checked to make sure they're still viable. Let's see, I've got some more examples of this form moving forward, but it's up to the district to notify the landowner before going on the property. And that is listed on the Form 3 that the property owner is acknowledging that they're allowing. So there's that covered base. And spot checks are handled at the district level and should be maintained and shared with VCAP staff, like I mentioned earlier. We don't really have any more requirements other than it should be handled with district and, you know, shared information with us, but we do want to give flexibility in how and when spot checks are done at the district level. And if you have any more questions, you can always reach out to Kevin or I, but we do like to leave it up to the district about how they wish to do the 25% selection of active projects. And obviously the districts that have a lot more implementation and have been doing VCAP for a lot longer have more spot checks to do than districts that maybe only do a couple projects per year or are just getting started. So some projects will be inspected more often depending on the district that they're in, but the idea is that every project should be inspected about twice and in a lifespan. And the purpose of the spot checks, just to make sure we're all on the same page, they're not a technical inspection. That's only done at the initial verification for payment request. Spot checks are a visible inspection, making sure that the practices are still there, they're viable throughout their whole 10-year lifespan. And the purpose is to go through, I'll have an example, but go through some guided questions and determine if there's any corrective action needed for, excuse me, for the BMP to continue to function. More common ways, like, are there any recommendations to give to the property owner if, you know, things need to be improved? Corrective action sounds very intense. Rarely is it as strong as that. But more information on this can be found in section 1.8 of the manual in more detail. And here is an example of that spot check form. This one happens to be rainwater harvesting. You can see on the left-hand side, there's a couple questions and they're yes or no that really guide you about how to do that spot check, especially if you're brand new or don't happen to know much about a more engineered project. And we do request that photos are submitted with this, so not only we can have those photos and see how the project is doing, but for your own documentation and having that on hand. Obviously, if you're not an expert in constructed wetlands, we ask you to use your best judgment and go maybe learn about the BMP before you go out to that spot check, but using your best judgment to answer these questions. And then at the end of the day, circle that, or sorry, check the box of that red circled area about the condition of the practice. Is it good? Does it need maintenance? Has it failed? And failed is something that we definitely want to avoid. If they're done every 2 years or so, we should never get to that point, but oftentimes they do need maintenance, or as simple as taking trash out of the conservation landscaping, and that would be something that would be needing maintenance, but also very simple. And at the very end, I'll go into more details about the corrective actions policy that we have in place. If you're looking to learn more about technical verification, which is not necessarily this, but if you are looking to learn more, I would highly recommend doing the CBLP training, Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professionals Level 1. I did it myself, as well as Kevin and a bunch of district staff, and it does really help give you experience in field verification, more so than what you need for this job, but it really does give you a bunch of knowledge and get you out in the field to actually practice doing that yourself. And this is just a general note about documentation through the process. It's good to know what you're going into your spot check, what exactly needs to be maintained by the district, and that would mean having the most updated planting plan, whether that, you know, it might have changed since the application was submitted. So know exactly the square footage and the location of the BMP that you're looking to inspect, especially if you have never been involved in that practice. If you're a new district staff taking over VCAP from a previous staffer, really helpful to have documentation to know what you're looking for and what it looked like at installation that needs to be maintained as. And there's often times where a landowner will expand the footprint of their project outside of VCAP, which is wonderful, such as conservation landscaping, but you don't need to inspect, you know, what was outside of cost share. So know that to make your job a little easier as well. And one last little note before I get into the BMP specifics is oftentimes with places of worship, HOAs or schools, the responsible party might turn over frequently, which means maintenance might fall through. So if this is the case, I would, as a district, recommend you have a more detailed maintenance plan than maybe just a property owner in a suburban area or such. Water. To have it more documented so it can be easily passed down for responsible parties, and make sure the HOA, school, etc. is aware that if there is a change in responsible party, they should let the district know, and also be educated on what's required of the BMP maintenance. This is pretty common as well. If it's at a public park or something like that, and a lawn care company is, doing their regular maintenance on the property, it should be, there should be communication about where the BMP is, so it's not mowed over a brand new rain garden. Maybe that would be signage, which also is great for education, or flags just to mark off the area to make sure that we don't get those BMPs destroyed by accident, because that's a mess and we don't want you all have to go through that either. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the BMP specific maintenance. And like I said, this training is from a canceled almost full day training, so I'm not going to go into full detail of what's included here, but I do want to show you where these resources are so you can refer back to them at a later date. Yes, we will go over general maintenance recommendations for these BMPs. Oftentimes the BMPs have subcategories, so just a caveat, this is a general maintenance recommendation. Each BMP maintenance plan should be site specific and really honed into what the site conditions are. And I hope this gives people a background about how they can better educate applicants at an initial site visit, help them create a maintenance plan for their application, and give them expectations about what their BMP might look like in 2 years, and help district staff feel more confident in spot checks as we will go through each BMP and what to look out for on spot check. All right, I will get started with conservation landscaping, I would say our most common BMP at this time. And for conservation landscaping, in terms of maintenance, it's important to note that the initial installation of the project is just as important and should be a part of the maintenance plan. You can see in these two pictures on the left, those are freshly installed projects, and they obviously are looking very different from what they will be in a couple of years. So that should be something that the homeowner is educated on. They should be able to recognize what exactly is in the ground at this time, because you can't really tell what those little seedlings are gonna be. They might look like weeds to a common person, maybe even myself if I went out there. So it's important to know what's the native plants that were a part of the planting plan versus unwanted weeds early on during establishment, because that's a really important time in the lifespan of this practice. And when just talking about the maintenance for conservation landscaping in general, homeowners should know, and this is probably something that's very obvious to people, but it shouldn't take more time or effort than traditional landscaping. It's not a hard sell in terms of this is going to require a lot of work to upkeep. It's no more so than a normal garden. And native plants, as they continue to grow, are more adapted to those conditions on site, so they should be a lot more self-sufficient, which is a selling point for this practice. Oops. So this is a chart I created with those resources that I mentioned earlier on in this presentation. General conservation landscape maintenance. Like I said earlier, obviously a tree planting is going to be very different from a meadow, but the vegetation requirements are nonetheless pretty similar throughout. I would say to point out on this, because again, I don't want to go through all this for time's sake. I don't want to bore you guys, but this is something that's out there. The required survival rate and planting density is something to look out for in not only conservation landscaping, but our other vegetative practices as well through their 10 years. Early on, a lot more watering is going to be required, and as it goes, that should be taken care of with natural rain. And the drainage area should be just, kept an eye on, keep an eye out for invasive species. Things like that should be pointed out in a VCAP application. If there are no invasive species nearby, that should be a part of the maintenance plan, something that they're expecting to be maybe an issue. Mowing is something that becomes a little trickier based on each practice, but has had issues in our program history. So developing a mowing plan with your applicant would be important if that's necessary, like a meadow. Winterization, pruning trees that might be causing any debris buildup or shade should be something considered. And like all practices, removing trash or debris, making sure pests aren't interfering with it, especially early on, and looking for signs of erosion or bare areas in the drainage area. It's a little blurry, I apologize. This is what the spot check form looks like for conservation landscaping. Pretty straightforward. I think this would be a relatively easy practice to spot check, especially as a new employee. You want to look and see, does the planting plan match what is there today? Is there at least 75% survival and 90% plant cover? And is there any signs of erosion, debris? Obviously, you go through each of these more in detail, but I'm not going to read through all of them. But if there's any questions, please ask Kevin in the chat box, or I can answer them at a later date too. Some common issues with conservation landscaping that would be good to be aware of. Here's an example on the left, a very good condition meadow that when inspected had quite a bit of bare areas, and they are having difficulty keeping that vegetation there. And it ended up being improper mowing was the reason for that. But other reasons that could cause issues such as this would be erosion from an upsite construction site, or just an unstabilized drainage area causing sediment clogging, which would cause dead vegetation. Pests or disease, drought conditions, or standing water, and all those things would be something that you would note on a spot check form to make a plan moving forward how to correct. And these are not VCAP problem, or one of these is a VCAP project, but these are just in general. Other things to look out for would be weeds, trash, especially in public places or public roads where it's kind of out of the control of the landowner. Invasive species, like I mentioned, tree tube problems, excuse me, or the planting density is way too low, too much mulch, anything like that. Relatively simple to fix, but is considered a maintenance issue and something that should be corrected to maintain that proper planting density. These are some examples, again, not VCAP, but what are larger issues that you would want to involve Kevin or myself to talk about? If you go for a spot check and the project is simply not there, that's definitely a major issue and one that we should be contacted for, especially your district board as well. When it comes to natural disasters, flooding, tornado, fire, hurricane, that's also something that you want to get us involved in so we can take the proper steps to decide what to do with that. Okay, I'll move on to permeable pavement next. Excuse me. For permeable pavement, preventative maintenance is really important for these projects, and a lot of contractors will make recommendations about how to maintain, which is great, but at the same time, those should not be disregarded, but the standard for VCAP specifications still need to be maintained regardless of what the contractor or manufacturer recommends. The most common maintenance problems to look out for and to educate applicants or landowners would be sediment clogging or broken pavers, shifting pavers causing the BMP to fail. Maintenance is required to include the surface material, meaning the pavers and the fine gravel in between, the observation well, if present, as well as under drains, and the drainage area, which usually means the downspouts connected, the rooftop, or the site just surrounding it. And this is the one that I really would recommend the district and maybe a landowner, if they're interested, to refer to the DEQ's BMP clearinghouse. It's got a very thorough and really great overview of the standards for permeable pavement and the maintenance that's suggested to maintain them. Things to avoid on permeable pavement surface. Usually things involving the car, oils, any kind of chemicals really should be avoided because those can leak into the pavers and cause issues. Sanding, construction activities, resealing or resurfacing the driveway is a big no-no. Power washing the house should be avoided, or just be very cautious that those debris that are coming off would not clog the pavers. Wintertime storage of snow piles, hitting sand or de-icing or salt, those can cause issues as well. Same thing with big mulch piles or soil. And like I mentioned, the car or lawnmower maintenance should be just done off of the pavers just to avoid anything. Here is again a little calendar I put together based on those materials that I used. A lot of it again is preventative, so it's taking a look at the drainage area early on. There's a bit of flexibility in how these can be maintained in terms of you can choose to use a leaf blower, which in my opinion would be the most readily available, vacuum, dry sweep. A lot of contractors will be involved in this, which is great because these may not be easily accessible to a lot of people. And checking the downspouts and other inlets to make sure sediment is being collected before it reaches the pavers. And annually looking to make sure the surface material is not broken or loose, checking the observation well, under drain and drainage area, like I mentioned on the previous slide. Every 2 to 3 years, depending on use, to replace those fine stones at the very top, or using a specialized vac truck to clean those problem areas. And if there's any vegetation growing up, that should be removed certainly and checked to make sure that's not a continuing issue. It is recommended that district staff on their spot checks for permeable pavement complete a falling head infiltration test. A lot of the functionality of permeable pavement is not seen at the surface, it's happening underneath, so it's difficult to spot check when we can't really see what's happening beneath the surface. But again, examining the pre-treatment gutters, pavers, all of that, and making sure that the drainage area is stabilized. And talking to the homeowner about have they seen any issues with standing water, making sure it's an open conversation so you guys are both on the same page and you can be helpful if there are issues to nip those in the bud as quickly as possible. Some common issues, some of these are larger than the scale of VCAP will offer normally, but this picture on the left is actually right after installation, so it's not an issue for now, but if a spot check was done and saw loose soil next to the pavers, that would be an issue and that would need to be stabilized immediately. That could cause issues such as sediment buildup between the pavers, like that photo in the middle. That's really clogged up and would not drain properly, causing issues like the surface ponding at the photo next to it. And the surface ponding is a big red flag for something happening beneath the surface that's not right. And really common, we see leaves and pine needles on the surface. Something like a leaf blower would be really helpful in removing those so they're not sitting on them long and breaking down and getting into the crevices, causing clogging. Larger issues that these are not VCAP projects, but if a permeable pavement was to go be neglected for a long time, these are issues that could happen, like sediment caking, vegetation growing through, and these would be quite an expensive maintenance issue to solve. So those are what could go wrong, but should be avoided with regular spot checks and open communication with the homeowner. Something like a driveway hopefully does not receive this much sediment and would not be an issue. One other thing that I wanted to point out too with permeable pavement is a lot of times we do see issues upon an application that maintenance might be an issue moving forward, such as we already see a bunch of pine needles or sand, just bare areas nearby. And while we see it's an issue, the landowner signing that Form 3 is really all that really needs to be said, is that if they're signing that Form 3, then they are obligated to maintain that permeable pavement as required of them. So though we see issues, and you might see issues too, just having that conversation about, how we can combat that issue is important, but at the end of the day, it is the landowner's responsibility to keep that maintained. We'll go back to a more vegetative practice. Rain garden bioretention I looped in together here. Really, their standards are quite similar in terms of what's required of them, just a matter of scale that separates the two. Just like conservation landscaping, rain garden and bioretention should be maintained at their inlets, their outlets, if present, the under drain observation well, and pre-treatment cells. That's a big part of maintenance for rain gardens. And something to look out for, and something that homeowners should be aware of, or landowners, is that water should not be standing for more than 48 hours after a rain event. If there is standing water, that means there is some issues happening beneath the surface, and that's when we want to get some corrective action and make some recommendations to fix that. But a lot of the reason that we have such strict standards for rain garden bioretention is that we look at the soil type and the water table and the drainage area, and we make sure they're properly sized where we hopefully avoid these kind of issues. These are just worst case scenarios that we want to look out for. Another one of those maintenance calendars, again, very generalized. Some rain gardens and bioretentions might look very different, but as a whole, this is the maintenance that should be expected. The drainage area should be really kept an eye on, the same planting density requirements, although mulch is a bigger part of a rain garden than conservation landscaping. I don't want to go into too much detail just for time's sake. I'll go ahead and go to the next one. Yep, so here the rain garden bioretention spot check form are identical. So you want to making sure that the water is not being diverted or obstructed when it's getting into the rain garden or bioretention cell. For public areas, trash could be a bigger issue to look out for, as well as sediment and debris buildup could cause sediment caking on the surface and kill some of the vegetation, so that one should be avoided. Invasive species are something to look out for. Again, the 48 hours of pooling water is a red flag. And looking at an under drain or observation well, if possible and that's present, will be really helpful in the spot check. Some issues to look out for. These are, again, not VCAP projects. As a whole, it's difficult to find maintenance issues for VCAP projects because they've been maintained very well, so that's a good problem to have. But to look out for rain gardens or bioretention should be, is it way overgrown, needs weeding? Not only is that a safety issue for places like a school, but that's going to be really difficult to get back to the planting plan if it's really neglected for a long time. Look for erosion inside or on the side slopes of the rain garden or bioretention. Standing water, especially early on if that's noticed, should be looking to make a change to fix that. Blocked inlets or outlets, such as that photo below with the leaves blocking the inlet, that would cause water to be diverted and not be treated in the rain garden like intended. Accumulated sediment at inflow could be similar to the leaves, just a sediment. Invasive plants, and then lacking vegetation cover or mulch where it's not going to be maintaining water like it should. This was a VCAP project, or is, and this is a pre-treatment cell. And it's clear that there is some vegetation growing and there's some sediment caking. It's doing its job. It's holding sediment and blocking it from getting into the cell, but that does need to be cleaned up. So it still continues to be a pre-treatment as it's supposed to be. There is some sediment caking from a red clay uphill construction site that was noted. So that's a reason for this. But if this is found on a spot check, corrective action would be needed or recommended to just clean out that pre-treatment cell. The rain garden itself looks really good. Vegetation is well maintained. Here is some pictures of larger issues that could happen, not VCAP projects, but like I mentioned, the sediment caking on the surface is completely overtaken by invasives where it's going to be really challenging to get back to those native plants. Or there's examples, unfortunately, sometimes the rain garden is completely mowed over during establishment, and then that needs to be replanted, unfortunately. Move on to dry well and infiltration. These two, obviously, there's different designs for dry wells and infiltrations even within the two categories, but they are lumped together with DEQ maintenance. And they shall include the pre-treatment devices, inlets, outlets, observation ports. If there's vegetation covered, that should be maintained, and or the BMP surface covering like this infiltration trench on the right. The rocks need to be maintained and cleaned of sediment and debris. General calendar, again, I don't want to go into too much detail just for time's sake, but the drainage area is a major part of the maintenance here, making sure it's stabilized, clear of debris, looking at the pre-treatment, inlets, downspouts. Observation wells are great. I would say most designs do have observation wells that we see here, and then those should be looked at on the spot checks and looked at 3 days after a rain event to observe for standing water. Checking structural damage, whether that means the downspout connection or any kind of piping. Vegetative cover if relevant, 2 times a year. And then annually or as needed, replacing the gravel, topsoil, or surfaces when clogged, and mowing vegetated strips if necessary. Yes, if there's any kind of trees that are, dropping any debris, that should be checked and pruned as needed. The two spot check forms are quite similar, but they are different. Here on the left is the dry well, and on the right infiltrations form. I won't go through these in detail because it's available on our website and here, but checking the downspout connection is common for both visible signs of water bypassing or short circuiting, trash, debris buildup, pooling water more than 48 hours. If it is a vegetated planting on top, is there dead vegetation, diseased, erosion at the overflow or outlet, and is the observation well in good condition, things like that. Some scenarios to look out for. This photo on the left was just installed, so I wouldn't say this is an issue as it was, but if you were to go out to a site and inspect a dry well and saw loose soil like this, that would be an issue. This happened to be just installed and the photos were taken right then and there, so that would be seeded and stabilized. And on the right is an infiltration trench, and a lot of issues going on with that one. You can see the leaves and the vegetation growing through, as well as the level spreader is not level, causing blockage, so that needs to be cleaned out. And just to be aware that the location is sometimes hidden for a dry well, so make sure it's not lost, cannot be found. That would be an issue. Maybe the district should be, also responsible to know this as well. Being careful not to mow over the observation well cap. That's an obvious one. Maybe painting this a fun color would be helpful. And then just an emphasis on sediment trapping before it reaches the trench or dry well. And there's an example of a dry well on the left here and a photo from the Chesapeake Stormwater Network, I believe. Just keeping your gutters clean before it enters the dry well. Rainwater harvesting, we're moving right along. Deceivingly has a lot of maintenance recommendations. I think the main kicker for this one is just cleanliness. I'm avoiding, mold, algae, mosquitoes, things like that. But in terms of VCAP in our manual, maintenance shall include the gutters, the downspouts, pre-treatment, inlets, and outlets. And winterization is a big part of this as well, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But in the fall and spring, recommended to inspect and clean the cistern and the lid, the screening devices, the first flush diverters, keeping all that clean and avoiding debris before it gets into the cistern. Making sure the mosquito screens are secure. There's not any holes or openings which allow mosquitoes to enter. No one wants to deal with that. Looking for things like pollen and organic matter, especially in the first year, so you can know when and how is the best cleaning method for your site. Every site's going to have different kind of overhead trees, so that's something that should be site specific. Winterization is going to vary based on the design of the cistern, but I would say the most common method that we see very often in our applications is to completely disconnect the collection lines and empty the pumps and pipes before first freeze. If it's below the frost line, underground, not so necessary, but that's up to the homeowner to decide that. And then before putting it back together, looking for any cracks before hooking up again. And this also might vary based on the water use plan. If you're going to need that through the winter and weather will allow it, it's again up to the applicant to decide that and put that in their operation and maintenance plan in the application. Every third year, just looking at the vegetation overhead and preventing debris buildup on the cistern. I've got some photos on the next slide of kind of worst case scenario that I found on the internet. Looking at the foundation, making sure it's still secure, the pumps, the pipes. If there is, outside of VCAP specs, hook up to the interior water, that's something that should be inspected, but again, it's not part of VCAP. And then 4 times a year, so just replacing anything that's damaged, reconnecting any disconnected pipes after a storm or what have you, just looking at the pre-screen devices and clearing them out so they continue to pre-screen as they're supposed to. A spot check for rainwater harvesting. We don't need you climbing up on the roof to get inside these things or anything like that, but again, it's a visual inspection. Looking to see, are the gutters and downspouts clear? Are there any cracks or leaks? Is the cistern lid and such functioning and clean? Is the foundation pad shifted or anything like that? Sediment accumulation, algae, mosquitoes. It should be pretty clear if there is any kind of odor or anything like that. and making sure that the overflow pipe is not leaking or cracked. Some issues that you could find, issue on the left is actually pretty simple. The pipe became disconnected. I believe that's a school. Pretty obvious and a pretty easy fix. Issues on the right are from the internet, and I hope this wouldn't happen. But if the gutters get so clogged and end up blocking the whole cistern, that would be a problem, as well as a simpler issue, debris buildup on the screen. Should be really easy to clean, but if that's seen on a maintenance spot check, would be recommend to clean that. And hopefully mosquitoes, haven't gotten through the mosquito screen, as long as that's well maintained for. Okay, we're getting to, I believe we have 3 more. Vegetated stormwater conveyance. We actually just did some major updates to these specifications at this fiscal year 21 program updates that Kevin might talk about. If not, will be obviously in our manual. But with each of our subcategories for vegetated stormwater conveyance, maintenance is required to include the pretreatment, inlet, outlet, check dams, grade control structures, all that. I won't go through all these, but as a whole, if they're vegetated, they're required to be maintained as our vegetated practices are. Looking for any kind of sediment clogging every year, crest kind of thing. Looking at the drainage area, is it stabilized? Is there excess ponding for dry swales? Is there too much woody vegetation in the wet swales? All these things would be looked at, and we'll talk about in the next slide as well. But looking at all the components under drains, check dams, things like that. For a spot check, like I just mentioned, you want to survey vegetation, drainage area, signs of sediment clogging. Specifications might be slightly different for each iteration or each dry swale, sepal conveyance, or wet swale, but our inspection sheet is the same. Looking at the under drain, inlet, outlet, and that the check dams match approved design plans. And like all these BMPs, they're visibly looking, maintained, and they match the design plan that they were approved and installed for. Living shorelines, one of our more, different projects, but we still have maintenance for them. I would say for this, more so than a lot of the projects, maintaining a photo log would be really important to see how these are continuing to develop and stabilize the shores. There is, possibility for storms and things like that. So having that photo log is important. And I think that's something that you can ask of the homeowners, making sure that the shoreline continues to be stabilized with the organic and structural materials as installed. And these are photos from different points. I think most of these are just after installation. But as a general living shorelines maintenance, checking on these new plantings, especially after a storm, taking into account that there might be loss of vegetation, and that's normal, so plan to replace those. Big one is to monitor for invasives such as Phragmites or goose or other animal issues. Checking for plant survival every year to maintain that 90% cover. Replace every year if needed. Remove trash and debris. Look for any kind of damage, maybe from boats, anything like that every year should be assessed. And making sure that the sills are stable. Slope is still maintained at a fill of 10:1 or flatter, replacing sand if necessary, and then as needed, removing debris, especially after storms, driftwood, things like that. And if shade becomes an issue that wasn't a part of the intended planting plan, pruning overhead branches to make sure that the shade's not blocking the marsh vegetation that's needed to be continuing to grow. And uniquely for living shorelines, the best reference would be VIMS for more in-depth about their maintenance plan. It's not in the clearinghouse. For a spot check for living shorelines, looking at the vegetation cover is the most important part, looking for invasives, anything that's causing vegetation growth to be hindered, looking at the sills, like I mentioned, and signs of debris or erosion. Potential for storms, like I mentioned, hurricanes, are out of the control of any of us. So large-scale damage should be handled on a case-by-case basis. Kevin and I and the association are here to help. Obviously, we know that they're vulnerable, especially early on. So just keeping a good relationship with the homeowners and keeping us involved will help you with any issues that we hope don't come up. This one more, I'll fly through these so Kevin has time for his updates as well. Green roof, big kicker for this one is that we don't need you putting your safety at risk. You don't need to be climbing on the roof. Again, it's a visible inspection. So if you're able to use a ladder or so to take a look safely, that's great, but keep your own safety in mind. The maintenance for the homeowner is expected to include vegetation, soil media, drainage systems, and structural integrity. And OSHA requirements do come into play here, so make sure the homeowner is aware of their own safety precautions. And vegetation and structural integrity obviously depends on the soil depth and the type of green roof that's installed. Deceivingly little maintenance for this, but just as important to make sure plant growth is still good, meets our specifications, replacing dead or diseased, and making sure the structural integrity of the roof is there. Look for leaks, drainage problems, debris in the roof, drains and gutters, mow or trim as needed. And yes, I mentioned this already. I'll just fly through this, but this will be available. Last but not least, constructed wetlands. Again, we did just do a pretty large update on this that Kevin may or may not talk about, but the specifications will be in our new manual. Maintenance for constructed wetlands shall include pre-treatments, inlets, outlets, water control structures if present, vegetation in their various planting zones as required, and they should maintain a permanent base flow. All this should be decided during the operation and maintenance plan. This should not be a surprise to anyone installing constructed wetlands. Here's the general maintenance calendar. Obviously would differ based on the size and drainage area of the project, but looking at the sites in the first 6 months after large storms, stabilizing the drainage area, any bare areas, reinforcing plants as needed, quarterly mowing the embankments and inspecting inlets for clogging or unwanted vegetation invasives, and then annually monitoring vegetation growth, sediment accumulation in forebays and micro pools, inspecting upstream and downstream banks for changes, such as construction, annual burrows, woody growth, and making sure that maintenance access points are available, safe, moving trash, debris, and inspecting all mechanical components if present. We've never actually had a constructed wetlands completed, so this spot check form has never been used, but we are hopeful someday it will, especially with our new specifications, checking on the planting density, drainage area stabilized, all the components, inlets, pre-treatments, outlets, and pools, sediment accumulation, and water levels would all be a component of the constructed wetland spot check. Some issues to look out for when and if we have a constructed wetlands project: invasive species, much like living shorelines, phragmites, and cattails, woody species that I mentioned. Mosquito problems are something that we get asked about a lot and should not be an issue with a well-designed constructed wetlands, but professional assistance may be involved with if mosquitoes were to be present and become an issue. Oh, and then sediment removal every 3 to 7 years, depending on the project. Okay, the last 2 slides. If a BMP is found to be having issues, not being viable or in compliance with our standards, the district will be making recommendations to fix. Sometimes it might be past that point. We of course don't want that to happen and get to the point where repayment back to the association is necessary. But if a BMP is found to be destroyed or completely removed, district will contact the participant with the notice of corrective action. This can be found in section 1.8, and again, I think we just did a couple updates on this in this new manual. Districts should clearly document the reasons for these, corrective action needed, and that's something that we would greatly appreciate being involved in. We want to help you if there are some serious issues and work with you. Want to be understanding as reasonable as possible. Our manual says there's a 6-month grace period to repair the BMP with the district to re-inspect after that time. Again, we want to be understanding and reasonable and be involved to try and get this fixed if there are major issues. And, worst case scenario, if deemed necessary by the district board, participant may be required to pay back a prorated amount of that cost share. And this occurred once this year, actually. If there is a transfer of ownership and the new property owner does not wish to accept the responsibility, the original recipient of the cost share can pay back that cost share amount on a prorated amount. So this doesn't always have to be a worst case scenario. This could be a choice. But in the case of death of participant, repayment may be waived, and there's a process for that in our manual. More severe circumstances, a cost share repayment hardship exemption should be submitted to the steering committee. We want to be reasonable and help you with this. And if property owner moves, like I said, that's an option for a repayment option. And these are the resources that I mentioned very beginning of my presentation. Really helpful if you're looking to learn more and see more pictures and diagrams. I highly recommend that you take a peek or reference these or give these as reference to your applicants if they're looking to learn more as well. So that's all I got, Kevin. I'm going to close out of this and then transfer my screen to Kevin.
Thank you so much, Maura. I'll switch over to my screen in just a moment. Thank you all so much for joining so far. You all have been really easy on me in the chat box. So if you do have questions and you want those addressed while the webinar is still going, please don't hesitate to ask. I will be taking you now. Hopefully you can all hear me, see my screen and everything. I'll be taking you through a much briefer update on where we are with new updates to the manual. And yes, I this year chose to call them policy improvements. That sounds so much nicer than policy changes. For the most part, we've kept it very simple, and we're just adding kind of clarifying language and everything for things that we commonly get questions for. So with that, what we're going to be running through is what's new for this year. There are some new rules in place, new policies, and I will address those as we go through. You see there on the right image of our brand new manual, which went up on the website this morning. It's got a new cover and everything, just so it's easy to, to discern from past manuals. We ask that you use those. With us all being, so remote this year, everything that's going on, we are electing not to print hard copies of the manual this year. So you can download the full PDF, print them if you wish, or just work with them digitally. But we're not going to be printing them this year. You'll see some photos on the cover of the manual there of really good BMPs that we've installed. You will also see photos throughout my short slideshow of other BMPs, sometimes taken out of context to show, oh, this is what a bad site would look like, but it's really just a BMP that's in the middle of construction or something like that. So if you recognize a BMP, don't worry, I'm not criticizing it. I'm probably just using the photo as an example. We have made some updates to the ranking score system, which we will go through briefly. If you currently have a project from your district on the waitlist, don't worry. It doesn't need to be updated or resubmitted this year, but you will see a new policy moving forward starting next July that any projects on the waitlist will need to be updated accordingly. We wanted to give some folks a heads up on that, so waitlist won't carry over into a new fiscal year moving forward. There are very few changes to BMP specifications. As Maura mentioned, constructed wetlands and vegetated stormwater conveyances, we've kind of overhauled the layout and description of those, but still not huge changes to the specifications for the practices. Otherwise, everything is very minor. Changes to cost share rates caps for 2 practices, and a reminder that our steering committee over the coming year will be focusing on developing basic operations and maintenance guidelines for each practice, some of what Maura just went over, and she's already created some really great documents to get that started. With that, what you'll see here on some of my slides is, bad PowerPoint skills, where I put too much text on it. I'm going to be focusing on the things that are bolded and underlined because that is the new language, the new policy, and I've left some of the other stuff in there as a framing for where that policy is and as just reminders of those existing policies. So one important thing, we've always said it's cost share is not for new construction, not for new sites, but we also want to clarify that it is not meant to be installed when there is active construction on the site or when there are open building permits for other projects going on, the site should be stabilized, should be ready for that work. So if, for example, you saw this situation on the photo on the right here, when you went out to do an initial site visit for, say, impervious surface removal or permeable pavement or something like that, that is already well underway and in the middle of construction, and would not qualify. We want to make sure that we can have a full assessment of the site, know what the design is going to look like, and get that all approved ahead of time. We've also added some clarifying language for land conversion. This is important. We often see or sometimes see former agricultural land, forestry land, or even just land that was cleared a few years ago and hasn't really been properly stabilized, come looking for a cost share for these BMPs. And what we want to make sure is that landowners have appropriately stabilized and converted land like that first. And then if there's still a need for a stormwater BMP, then they can consider applying. From an operational standpoint, at the district level, we just want to clarify that once funds, no matter where they come from our various grant sources, federal, state, or otherwise, once they are funneled through the district and paid out to homeowners, it is considered local funds. That was something we had clarified with our auditors last year. And a reminder that the appropriate tax forms should always be distributed and collected during this process, namely gathering a W-9 from an applicant at the time of application and making sure that you distribute a 1099 to them at the end of the year. We do occasionally get calls saying, I didn't know I was going to get a 1099 for this, or shouldn't I have gotten a 1099 for this? So we just want to make sure that that is happening with each and every project. Now, if they're receiving less than $600 in cost share, they don't technically have to file that, but we would encourage every district to still go through this process anyway, just to cover the bases. For FOIA issues with VCAP, which so far we haven't had many of, but those will be referred to the individual district where the question is coming up as a local government entity. So always refer to your FOIA representative at the district for those issues. Some updates to steering committee participation. As most of you know, we added officially Northern Virginia Soil and Water and Henricopolis Soil and Water to our steering committee this past year. So all of our spots are full now. There are 6 total districts plus the association represented on the steering committee, but we do want to continue to solicit new districts in the coming years to have some turnover and have some variety in the districts sitting around that table. And that means that on July 1st, at the end of a 2-year term, we'll be looking for that. If for any reason a district has some staff turnover, doesn't have folks available to sit on the steering committee, we may solicit districts for a replacement, and that's done through a simple application. And there you can see in that photo the steering committee in action on a field visit to a bioretention facility in Charlottesville. As far as funding deadlines are concerned, this is what I was mentioning at the beginning of grandfathering waitlisted projects. Typically what we've done is that any project received before the end of the fiscal year, we consider it on a wait list and beholden to the policies when it was submitted. We are not going to have a wait list crossover into the new fiscal year anymore because every July 1 we update policies, we update cost share rates. We update some specifications. So we just want districts to know this, that if it's getting to be May, June, and you've got projects sitting on the wait list, you may need to reevaluate and resubmit some of those applications. Typically, that's not going to mean completely overhauling or completely changing the application, just updating a few things. And it's really about messaging with homeowners that, hey, you're submitting this time of year. If there's a funding backlog, you may want to just wait till July, or just know that you may have to provide some new information coming up. So, and then again, not really new policy, just with a caveat added to it. Whenever the steering committee approves funding for a project, it must be completed by June 1st of the following year. So anytime this year in 2020, calendar year 2020, that a project is approved, it must be completed by June 1st of 2021. That mostly has to do with our grant cycles. And we have added the caveat, unless otherwise required, of certain funding sources, because we do at times get somewhat unexpected, surges in funding that would allow us to kind of loosen those deadlines. That actually happened last year, if y'all recall. So we're trying to just be flexible with that. A few reminders when it comes to funding allocation and applications. We have run into this a few times that the submission of an application, whether it's to you at the district or to us as a steering committee, that does not guarantee cost share funding. Just because you've submitted an application does not guarantee that you will get approved, or you'll get funding allocated. If your application is approved by the district board and the steering committee, then you are guaranteed that funding, assuming you complete the practice to specifications. That money is allocated, is set aside at that time, but we don't want homeowners or districts under the impression that as soon as they submit an application, they're going to get that funding. That's not always guaranteed. And then just some updates here. We've had sort of this policy in place about applications needing to be submitted with a certain file name format and as a single PDF for a while now, but we are kind of codifying it. We really need, because sometimes these applications come in with dozens of files and it gets a little confusing and things can get lost. So it should follow that naming format, and most importantly, come in a single PDF document. And we are, we've kind of pilot tested this minimum ranking score over the past year, and it is now official. Any project must have a minimum ranking score of 65 in order to be considered by the steering committee. As a reminder, for districts entirely outside of the Chesapeake Bay who have not yet participated in VCAP, there are bonus points associated with your first 3 applications to kind of get you in the game and get you some level footing with folks. The project must still meet the 65 minimum ranking score first, and then those bonus points are applied on top of that. So you can't have a ranking score of 55 and then get your bonus points because it's your first application and have it qualify. It still has to meet the basic standards for that practice first. In regards to our 90-day start of work policy, we've had this pretty much since the program began, that once the steering committee approves a project for funding, folks have 90 days to get started to demonstrate their commitment to the project and that they're going to move forward with it, or else we will pull that cost share back and reallocate it to another project because there is high demand pretty much at all times now. With how things are going in 2020 so far and everything that's going on in the world, we've just seen a huge surge in folks asking for extensions. So we are basically just passing that authority down to the district, that if a district deems a 90-day extension is warranted, they can grant it without getting steering committee approval. The most common is, planting season issues, that type of thing. But now we're seeing a lot more of, the city was going to do some work on my driveway first, and then I was going to do my project, but they haven't showed up because they're backlogged. That type of stuff happening from COVID. So we're just trying to be flexible with that, and we don't need to see that request every single time. But we do ask that the district notifies us when that's been extended, so we know what's going on with the project. Project on the right is actually an impervious surface removal and permeable pavement project in the works, which is great. I put this here as an example of what we don't want to see. If someone is, we consider a 90-day start of work to be they physically started work on the project. What we don't want to see is I'm at day 89, I'm about to run out of time, so I'm going to start work by just bashing up all the concrete, to meet that requirement, and then leave it sitting like that. That we would rather communicate with the homeowner, with the district, to see what's going on and make sure they're still trying to pursue the project than something like this to just, meet that basic standard. So I hope that makes sense. In regards to our Form 7, which was new last year, I believe, we have overhauled that form this year. It's the only form of ours that we've made significant changes to other than the ranking system. Really just to simplify it, to get rid of any bid requirements or anything like that. And it's basically just a single document that says, hey, we ran into some unexpected costs, or we increased the size of our the footprint of our project, or we went with a different contractor who had different prices. It's important to know for a district and for an applicant that the amount of cost share they're approved for by the steering committee at the time they're approved, that's the only amount of cost share they're guaranteed. If they spend more, do more, run into other costs, they're not guaranteed to get more cost share, and they'll never go above the cap for cost share for a project. But they can submit to the steering committee a request on Form 7, that this is why costs went up. This is why we're requesting more cost share. And typically, if it's a reasonable request, we will approve it. We have also, it's worth noting that that's not only dependent on the discretion of the steering committee, but if we are out of funding, for example, right now on a funding wait list, or as of yesterday on a funding wait list, we may not be able to approve that. And we just want folks to be aware of that. And clarifying this year for the first time that no matter when the project is installed, when it's inspected by the district, when it's approved by the steering committee, the lifespan start date is not until January 1st of the following year, to keep things in line with other cost share programs and just to simplify those policies. We have made in the manual and on the ranking sheet some updates to what our resource concerns are. Most you'll see the language of impervious surfaces and compacted or poorly managed lawn, increase the volume and rate of runoff. The photo here, is a very good example of an obvious resource concern that's not addressing the conditions on the site and needs some additional work. There may be some simple recommendations to stabilize that site before a BMP goes in. But really what we're trying to step away from is, I already have grass, I already have a mulch bed that's pretty well handling stormwater on my site, but I just want a nicer garden. I just want a better native plant habitat. Those are great things, but may not kind of meet our standard for a true resource concern. We're just kind of trying to clarify that a little bit, and we'll hit on that again with the ranking spreadsheet as well. A little bit of clarification here. This photo is just kind of one of those greatest hits when it comes to resource concerns on a site. Maybe a BMP is not even needed. It just obvious corrections. That's more there for entertainment for all the stormwater geeks on the webinar today. But that being said, adding some clarifications to what resource concern is being addressed, and that the BMP is addressing that resource concern. And we're not trying to discourage treatment trains in any way, but when it comes to cost share funding for BMPs, what we are really encouraging is, if there is a resource concern, an appropriately sized, appropriate BMP type project should be selected to treat that resource concern. So if, for example, you've got too much water coming off your roof through a downspout, and you put in a rain garden that is appropriately sized and addresses that issue, you don't necessarily need conservation landscaping cost share at the outfall of that rain garden, unless there is another source of stormwater coming, for example, across the yard that will also intercept. But generally speaking, these projects, we don't need to see multiple BMPs with cost share in a row, and each BMP is going to have to address its own resource concern. And also some clarifying language. We've been kind of enforcing this all along, but putting it into writing in the manual. These BMPs are designed to address stormwater and only surface stormwater. If there is groundwater seepage or man-made sources of water runoff, which we have had some inquiries about, that's not going to qualify as a resource concern or for the cost share that we're providing. The easiest example that we see a lot is a sump pump from a basement, bringing that groundwater back up and having an outfall somewhere in the yard that's causing an issue. That's not going to qualify for cost share for a BMP. That will need to be handled at the homeowner's expense or with some other method other than a full stormwater BMP. As for BMP specification updates, as we've said, we're keeping it easy this year. We did really revisit some BMP specifications last year and kind of overhaul a few of our BMPs. We have made significant changes to constructed wetlands and vegetated stormwater conveyance, mostly to make them more accessible, to make them more scalable for residential properties. And those would need to be revisited in some depth, which hopefully we'll be able to do in another training in the coming year. So I'm not going to try to dive into all of that right now. Please, I encourage you to read through the new manual, especially those two BMPs. As Maura mentioned, we've never done a constructed wetland. We have done quite a few vegetated stormwater conveyances, but rarely on an individual residential property. And so, what we're finding is that the ability to fit these onto small lots to treat small resource concerns is not really there. And so we're trying to make those, fit a little more with the program and the folks that we're serving. There are some minor updates throughout on the other BMPs, kind of just clarifying a few things. The biggest single, most important, I guess, BMP specification update has to do with permeable pavement. We have seen a huge amount of demand for permeable pavement over the last year plus at this point. In the early days of VCAP, you could install permeable pavement anywhere, even if it was replacing, your grass front yard with a new driveway made of permeable pavement. That was okay. Then we updated to say, if you are replacing a pervious surface with permeable pavement, you need to treat additional impervious surface, i.e., put in a brand new driveway that's made of permeable pavement where there wasn't a driveway before. You need to tie in at least one downspout, so you're treating some of the roof. What we are updating this year is to say, if you're replacing pervious surface with new permeable pavement, and therefore creating new hardened surfaces, even though permeable pavement is permeable, it is a hardened surface, you must offset the same amount of impervious surface elsewhere. So whatever footprint of new driveway you're putting in, you have to, for example, connect that much of the roof, same square footage to offset. And it still must be the most appropriate and cost-effective practice to go in that spot. So we're just trying to make sure that these permeable pavement projects are addressing significant resource concerns, and that they're not just kind of coming out net zero balance on impact on water quality and reduction. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. On the ranking spreadsheet, there's kind of 3 areas we've revisited. Generally speaking, ranking system is still the same. The sheet still operates the same way. You'll see we've updated the color scheme a little bit and put FY21 on it just so you can differentiate it. We will be looking for that ranking spreadsheet moving forward instead of the old one. The three different areas we've visited, the updates to the resource concern category, which I went through earlier, really just clarifying the excess runoff thing rather than just saying too much impervious surface, showing that it is causing a resource concern, and you'll see that in the very first section of the ranking sheet there. We have revisited the idea of what partnership means in terms of those points. That needs to be another group or another entity that the applicant or the district is working with to help design, implement, install, maintain, whatever it may be, the BMP. That does not include organizations that the district has an MOU with to provide VCAP services. Some districts are doing that now. Or the most common example is I'm installing a living shoreline and VMRC permitted it, so I'm working in partnership with VMRC. That's not going to cut it anymore. We like seeing that collaboration between agencies and between organizations, but the idea of that partnership is you're choosing to involve more folks to capitalize on the impact of the project rather than I had to get a permit or I had to work with this group in order to make it happen. So really just trying to make sure that there is some true collaboration and broader impact happening because of that partnership. And finally, this was honestly a little bit of a loophole that existed in our ranking spreadsheet. It's not a problem, but public visibility of a project, basically in our old ranking sheet said, if you could see it from a road, from a trail, from the water, it was publicly visible and therefore had more educational value. We are clarifying that to essentially just add the word and is part of an educational program. That's how you get those points. You have to be able to access it, be able to see it, but it also needs to be part of a planned program to educate people about stormwater BMPs and their importance. And we're going to ask to see a plan for that and see who, most likely who you're partnering with, but also what the actual plan is for visiting that, whether it's on like a sustainable garden tour or as part of an outdoor classroom, or, to do ongoing, as you see in this photo, stormwater BMP trainings where you can demonstrate how a BMP works and kind of promote it that way. As far as cost share rates and caps go, just 2 changes this year to individual BMPs and then a little bit of a policy tweak. So if it hasn't already been made clear over the last few years of VCAP, depending on our grant sources, depending on our funding, depending on how the program grows and trends change, we can expect each year that there may be some tweaks to cost share rates and caps. That's just going to happen, and those will always take effect on July 1. Changes here to total caps. We've always had a $50,000 cost share cap, but that was per year. If you were, for example, a property owner who had a whole bunch of properties in a certain area, or a municipality or a school, you could do up to $50,000 worth of cost share each year. We've never really seen that capitalized upon, but we're still trying to make sure that we spread the wealth around, that as many people as possible can access these limited funds. So it is now 50,000 total in cost share, and that would be each different BMP. You hit the cap, and you'd have to do a variety of BMPs in order to even get to that 50,000. But that is also to say that for any applicant for a property that they own, they can only receive up to the cost share cap for each BMP type, and then that's it. Once you get $10,000 for permeable pavement, which is one thing I'll review here in a moment, once you get $3,500 for rain gardens, even if you do 5 or 6 rain gardens on your property, you're stuck at that $3,500 cap. The hope is that you don't need that many rain gardens on a single residential property, and again, to just kind of spread that funding around. And then some clarifying language. Again, this has kind of already been our policy, but we needed some clarification to it. Certain BMPs can be installed on 2 different adjoining properties. If, for example, one neighbor wants to do a conservation landscaping meadow in their backyard, and another neighbor wants to do conservation landscaping as a meadow in their backyard, that's fine. Each person is applying individually, maintaining their own BMP, and that BMP will function even if the neighbor moves and forgets about the meadow, or whatever it may be. A single functioning BMP, for example, a bioretention basin, cannot straddle 2 different properties. Cannot, if one single property owner cannot be responsible for the functionality and the maintenance of that BMP, we're not going to approve that. Unfortunately, there's just too many issues that come into play there. We know that stormwater does not follow property boundaries, but unfortunately, money and legality do. And we also are not going to provide essentially double cost share funding for any project like that does span 2 boundaries, where 2 people apply for the same BMP, but because it's across 2 borders, they get twice as much cost share. So the big question of the day, of course, just 2 changes here to the cost share rates this year. You'll see that we have bumped constructed wetlands cost share cap up significantly. Again, sort of just an attempt to really capture the complexity of constructed wetlands, not necessarily to entice people to do it, because if it's not a suitable practice for the property, we're not going to recommend it anyway, but to just recognize that it is a complex BMP, and that the cost share cap we had in place might have been discouraging some folks because it didn't really capture those costs. And then the biggest change, both the rate and the cap for permeable pavement, because there's, for a number of reasons, just trying to keep those costs down and keep that demand in check. Based on every project we've ever approved, ran all these numbers and decided that $10 per square foot as a rate cap was a reasonable cap for that, and then that will be up to 10,000 instead of 15,000. We find that for the most part as a reasonable price across the state for providing a percentage of cost share. We're not trying to, it's not always the goal to cover 100% of the cost, but hopefully that addresses that a little bit better. That's it for updates this year. Like I said, we kept it much simpler than years past. For those of you that have been doing VCAP for all, we've had other years where we spent full hour and a half just talking about the updates we've made. We're keeping it a little simpler for you this year. As I mentioned, as of this morning, all of these new documents, we have a brand new brochure, which we hadn't even mentioned yet. We have them all printed. They're here at the association office. We don't have any means to distribute them to folks right now, but we will eventually. All of those are available online on the website. And if you have any questions about them, please let us know. You can always contact us, that's me, Kevin, and Maura as well. I've got our email addresses on here because we are only sometimes back in the office at this point, mostly working from home. So that's the easiest way to get in touch with us. And we are always happy to work with districts and get folks going on VCAP. So hopefully most of the chat questions have been addressed. And with that, that's all I've got.
Kevin, real quick, can I ask you to clarify something?
Absolutely.
Okay, I was just typing it out, but it's kind of a wordy answer. There were some questions about what we mean now by per parcel of land, and I think I'm answering the question correctly, and I guess I can answer it just to make sure. But the 50,000 per entity or owner is limited to that lifetime span for that individual or spouse or whatever. But if an individual owns more than one piece of land, for example, an individual owns a bunch of rental properties, they're eligible to install more than one BMP type on those different lands.
Correct. Yeah, we're talking about each, on the simplest level, each house, each property is beholden to those caps. So if someone owns a bunch of different properties, they are addressing different resource concerns on different properties. What we're trying to avoid is a single property being subdivided up into different parcels to try to capitalize on cost share, or intentionally running a BMP over property lines so that it then becomes somehow two BMPs, basically just saying on this property for whoever owns it, you can get the cap for each BMP type.
Perfect. And then a follow-up for that, specifically with conservation landscaping, they cannot apply for more than one type of conservation landscaping and go above that cap. So an applicant on a parcel can't get funding over the cap for a meadow and a tree planting. They're limited to 3,500 for that parcel of land.
Correct. That's, yeah, conservation landscaping, while it does have subtypes of practice, that's one BMP type, any type of conservation landscaping. And often we do see kind of a mixture of some meadow, some mulch bed, whatever it may be, but it's still just one cap, one practice.
There's just a couple more questions. I'll just clarify this just while we're here. The educational partnership, if there is an MOU involved, that cannot be awarded points anymore, just because there is a legal agreement, I guess. So the answer to that question would be no. MOUs with soil water districts cannot be an educational partner to get points for.
And more, I would add to that the MOU alone does not qualify you for that educational value points, but an MOU also doesn't disqualify you. So if, for example, a Friends of group is working with a district to do site visits, help with applications, all that, that does not get you educational value. But if that Friends of group and the district work together to install a BMP, and then the Friends of group does an educational program there and takes people to visit it and teaches them about the BMP, that would qualify.
Gotcha.
Any other burning questions?
There's a couple. One just came in. Can we discuss the eligibility of the grass papers? From my understanding, still eligible.
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, nothing changed in terms of specifications for permeable pavement this year, aside from the cap and the amount of impervious surface that needs to be treated 1-to-1. Another question, how many Friends of groups are active with VCAP? It's a good question. Definitely we've got Friends of the Rappahannock.
Yeah, there's a number of them in various levels that are involved. We're working with some roundtables, some Friends of groups, some that just kind of help to promote the idea of the program, others that are directly working with districts. In terms of those MOUs and doing site visits, it's only a couple of Friends of groups, but in terms of any involvement with partnering, with promoting, all that, there's quite a few of them.
I'm just finishing one private chat, but that's the last burning question.
Okay, and obviously, we try to capture all the questions here, all the chats, but the ability to communicate with us and ask additional questions does not end with the webinar. So if there's anything we missed, or any questions you think of after the fact, please reach out directly to us. And if it's something that we really glossed over or that wasn't clear, we can even put some messaging out over the VCAP listserv. And on that note, if you have other staff in your office, partners you work with, directors who are interested who are not on the VCAP listserv, let them know or let us know that they should be on there, and we'll get them connected.
Awesome. Okay. Actually, one just more came in. That it's just a question about is there a benefit in converting a grass turf benefit converting turf to a meadow?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a little bit of what we're trying to get at with these updated resource concerns this year. If you already have long grass that you've allowed to grow up, that may not be quite as effective as a native meadow that is managed for that purpose, but it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to demonstrate a true resource concern or meet the minimum ranking score at this point if they're just converting from long unmanaged grass to a full native meadow. They're probably not going to meet the standard. And we would just have to look at that on a case-by-case basis of if there was some real other resource concern that would be addressed by that conversion.
That's actually the last one. Thank
All
you everyone
right.
for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Welcome to another year. Hope this was beneficial for everybody, and we look forward to working with you in the months to come.